and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new episode of Africa Today, where we get you the latest news and events taking place on the African scene. And today our topic will be on the U.S. Vice President's tour in Africa, and we will start off with our major top stories and reports. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris announced Wednesday in Ghana a $1 billion initiative to improve women's economic empowerment in Africa as she wrapped up the first leg of her tour in the continent. More details in this report.
Vice President Kamala Harris is pushing for $7 billion in private sector investment to help Africa prepare for the effects of climate change. The announcement comes as she wraps up her week-long trip to the continent. Harris plans to visit a farm outside Lusaka where workers are using new techniques and technology to grow more produce, part of the effort to demonstrate ways to secure food supplies despite global warming. The $7 billion announcement is the biggest ticket item that Harris has unveiled during her trip, but more work will be needed to follow through. The politics of climate change are complicated in Africa, which has contributed far less to overall greenhouse gas emissions than richer corners of the world like the United States. According to the International Energy Agency, 43% of the Africans did not have access to electricity in 2021, and recent outages have sparked frustration. Harris said that there were opportunities in the clean energy economy that could help generate growth in Africa. As for the money, President Joe Biden has requested $11 billion in his proposed budget to meet commitments in the Paris Accord.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and on the significance of the U.S. Vice President trip to Africa and her tour, we are glad to be joined over the phone by Dr. El Sayed Sabri, expert in climate change. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir, and thank you for joining us. Sir, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris is in a tour to the African continent. How do you see the significance of this tour?
I think this tour to the African continent, I think it may aim at helping the African countries to address the climate change issue, because the African continent is highly vulnerable to climate change impact. And I think this is the step from the United States to show that it has the concerns of the climate change impact on the African continent.
Mm-hmm. Well, Harris announced that she is pushing for a $7 billion in private sector investments to help prepare Africa to deal with its climate change effects. How far would this help in achieving Africa's aspirations with regards to dealing with climate change effects?
I think this amount of $7 billion to assist the African continent, it can help in advancing the efforts in the African continent to address the climate change, specifically the climate change impacts and the adaptation issue. But African continent needs much more than that, because there is the need for spreading the renewable energy, particularly the hydro, the solar renewable energy in the African continent. In addition to the upscaling of the industrial companies and industrial activities. So, but in a way, it is a good step to address this amount of money, $7 billion to the African community, that will help in pushing the efforts towards addressing the climate change in Africa.
Right. Dr. Sabri, did you agree that the effects of climate change are complicated in Africa, which has contributed to the overall greenhouse gas emissions that than other richer countries like the United States, for example?
The African continent suffers very much from the climate change impact. It's highly vulnerable to that. Meanwhile, the emissions from the African continent is very, very limited. It's about 4% or 4.5% of all the emissions of the world. So the main issue is to assist the African continent to adapt to the climate change impact, among which is the scarcity of water, the desertification, the droughts, and also the sea level rise, for example, in Egypt and the northern coast, and the effect on the biodiversity in the African continent. All this needs a lot of money to adapt to climate change. But regarding the other issue, I mean the mitigation issue, if we increase the use of renewable energy in African continent, because we know that renewable energies can make the adaptation to climate change and also the mitigation of climate change. Because all the renewable energy use a very reduced amount of emissions. This is the mitigation. In the same time, it supplies the expected insufficiency of the energy which is needed for the development in the African continent.
Right. Well, sir, during her tour to the African continent, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris is pressed on whether wealthy nations would supply the U.S. $100 billion annually to help poor countries deal with the effects of climate change.
Yes, this issue of this 100 billion US dollar not only for the African continent, it was mentioned to the developing countries. But this should be annually. But what happened is not that issue. All the amount that already supplied to the developing countries and particularly to the African countries is much more less than that amount, about from 20% maybe or up to 30%, not this amount of $100 million, $100 billion per year, annually.
Yes. Well, sir, Egypt also launched the Decent Life for Climate Resilient Africa initiative. How far do you think this initiative would help achieve development in Africa with regards to climate change?
I think this initiative is also important because it targets the decent life, as you mentioned. To facilitate the adaptation to climate change issue and also to afford the energy, which is very important for the development. And this energy could be, as mentioned, renewable energy, solar energy or hydro energy or wind energy. All these type of renewable energy is very important to make the life of the African people more decent and more viable, more easy than that this tough life now for the time being.
Right. Well, sir, how has climate change negatively affected the African continent, the greater bearer actually of climate change effects, and how has climate change impact been evident on African states this year in particular?
This year, I think, like the past years, and maybe more worse than the past years. Regarding the climate change impacts, we have seen the droughts in different regions, the scarcity of water, the food security is suffering, and you mentioned particularly in the area of the Sahara, and also the Somalian country, in different parts in the African continent. There is a suffer of the, crop production and also the water scarcity. In addition to in the north, for example, in Egypt also, the impact of the sea level rise on the northern coast of Egypt. In addition also to the impact of the biodiversity on the African continent, which is very, very important for the food security in Africa.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sir, Egypt has warned at the recent climate change summit that Africa is the most vulnerable continent to the impacts of climate change. And why is this, and until when will Africa bear the effects of climate change more than other countries?
I think that this is because of the geographical position, geographical situation of the African continent. In addition to the scarcity of the development, Africa has no development enough in the different countries because for many years it was colonized, and the efficient use of their resources is not in the hands of their people, but on the hands of the others, of the developed countries' hands. And that's why they are suffering, because they have no enough technology or enough awareness and enough money, finance, to address the climate change impact. And if you don't be resilient and have the capacity to adapt to climate change, the impacts will be more worse on you. That's why the African continent, it's the poorest continent in the regard of development. But
right.
It is the richest continent in its resources. Mm-hmm. African continent has a very rich resources, but it doesn't own its resources. It is owned by the others. And that's why African continent suffers from the effects of climate change because it has no capacity, it has no enough technology, and it has no enough finance to address climate change.
Right. Well, I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Said Sabri, expert in climate change. Many thanks for your insight. And dear viewers, now we go back to our report. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris is pushing for $7 billion in private sector investments to help Africa prepare for the effects of climate change. More details.
U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris announced in Ghana a $1 billion initiative to improve women's economic empowerment in Africa as she wrapped up the first leg of her tour of the continent. Harris' office unveiled the program, largely funded by the private sector, in the capital Accra. The U.S. Vice President then left Ghana for Tanzania. Scheduled to last until April 2nd, her tour of Ghana, Tanzania, and Zambia comes on the heels of December U.S.-Africa Summit in Washington, D.C., where President Joe Biden called for a broad partnership with Africa as the U.S. seeks to assert its presence on the continent in the face of growing influence from China and Russia. Harris has already announced several aid packages, including $139 million for economic and cultural development in Ghana and $100 million investment in coastal West African countries facing the risk of spillover violence from the Sahel. The African Women Economic Empowerment Initiative includes nearly $400 million from the private sector to help bridge the gender digital divide. More than $500 million again from the private sector will also be used to support women's economic empowerment in Africa. The Vice President called for more investment in innovation in Africa, particularly in the digital economy, good governance, and democracy.
Welcome back, and still with our special reports. The UN World Health Organization said that life-threatening hunger caused by climate shocks, violent insecurity and disease in Africa is causing a lot of 130,000 people looking death in the eye. More details in this report.
In an appeal for $178 million to support humanitarian assistance across the 7 affected countries in the Greater Horn region, veteran WHO worker warned that the situation was worse than anything she'd seen in more than 2 decades in Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Uganda. In addition to the dramatic hunger crisis, the region has never seen such a higher number reported disease outbreaks this century, according to the WHO. The Greater Horn region is also in the grip of concurrent outbreaks of hepatitis and meningitis. In response to the emergency, the UN Health Agency intends to use its $178 million appeal to scale up treatment of people suffering from medical complications linked to a severe malnutrition. The WHO appeal will also help to make sure that the health system does not collapse by providing mobile health clinics. The WHO appeal will also help to make sure that the health system does not collapse by providing mobile health clinics as increasingly desperate pastoral communities leave their homes and arrive in towns.
Well, dear viewers, with that final report, we come to the end of this edition of Africa Today. Many thanks for watching and stay tuned for more coming up here on Nile TV International.